Hey, welcome back to Rough Cut Faith, everyone.
Hey,
Thanks for being here with us.
nice to see y'all.
Yeah, you can't see them.
I would love to imagine that I can. I've just got like.
I think maybe you do.
I probably
maybe
yeah,
you do.
yeah.
Scott,
I have an active imagination.
Scott does see you all. Maybe not all of you, but you in particular, you know
yeah.
who he's
Yep.
you know who
Yep.
he's talking about.
In the t-shirt.
Yeah, the one wearing pants. So,
It's hot. It's shorts,
it's
man.
That's true. That's true. Hey, thanks for joining us today. We are jumping into a bit of a different conversation.
Yeah.
We wanted to go a little bit lighter than we've had in the last few weeks.
Yeah.
So, a couple of weeks ago, or
Yeah.
a month or so ago, we
Yep.
talked about 2 nonfiction books. We took each episode, talked about the books that have
Yeah.
been really influential
Yeah.
for us that we've read in the last few months. And now we're going to talk about some fiction.
Ooh.
Yeah, because first of all, I'd like us to talk about why it's important to read fiction.
Is it?
I think it is. And since we are the authority on, we're authority on all things on this podcast.
Fictional.
Just between the
right
two
now,
of us. Yeah.
Before it gets edited, we can totally say what we want.
Yeah. So I think that we should talk about, is reading fiction important?
Sure.
Why it might be important, and then talk about a couple of books we've been interacting with that
Sure.
have been good.
The short answer for me in that is I think that there is a lot of value in reading fiction. It's not the primary thing that I read, but I think probably once we started the church, I made a decision that during the summers, instead of doing a lot of like the personal development or ministry focused type of books, I would engage in fiction, at least like a book or a series of books that in the summertime I would do something like that. And for me, one of the reasons I do it is, as a communicator, it is good to learn from storytellers.
Yeah.
It's good to...
So it's still personal development.
It still is in some ways, because you know me. But I love to find somebody that can create a world that I enter into.
Yeah.
And can appreciate the character development, can appreciate the... It's an exploration of the human mind, in my mind, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so I really like entering into those types of worlds. And so the fiction that I tend to approach, it's a variety. I've not really gotten into a lot of sci-fi fantasy. I mean, one year I did Lewis's space trilogy, which is Lewis, so it's different. But we've done I've read Lord of the Rings with the kids. I've read the Chronicles of Narnia with the kids, which probably honestly were more fun for me and more brutal for me.
Reading the Chronicles of Narnia as an adult.
Oh yeah.
I was like in tears through the entire series.
Yep. Yeah.
It's amazing.
I just appreciate Reepicheep even more as an adult than I did as a kid. You know. And I never read those books as a kid. I didn't start reading them until I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and I was oh wow, this is great. But then over the years, I think more and more, I'm like, wow, that's really good. I used to have this rule that I wouldn't go watch a movie unless I'd read the book, if it was based on a book. And so that's why I've read a lot of them. But I found them to be, it's just great to engage in story. It's great, I mean, we watch film. This is just film in the written form. And so much more of that development stuff for me, at least. I mean, but what do you like about fiction?
Well, I think fictional stories tell the truth in ways that other stories can't. In ways that maybe, I shouldn't say can't, but in ways that nonfiction stories don't. Leaving out biographies or autobiographies.
Sure.
There's all these different genres. But when I read a story that's a fiction, I look at the characterization and the exploration of that character.
Yeah.
The author gets to tell you what's happening in the mind of that character, in the mind of multiple characters, and how they're interacting and how they're engaging. And then as a reader, I'm saying this resonates with my
Sure.
experience.
Yeah.
Whether it takes place in a fantasy land,
Yep.
whether it takes place on a planet
Yeah.
somewhere,
Yeah.
whether it takes place on a historical time that's different than mine,
Yeah.
or in an alternate universe that's different than mine, no matter where the story is taking place, the author is saying, here's this character's experience,
Yeah.
here's how they're processing it, here's how it
Here's
plays out,
Yeah.
and then I, as a reader, am going, that resonates with
Yeah.
who I am. That resonates with my
Or
life
I know
experience.
people like that.
Or
Yeah.
I know people,
Yeah.
or I can see this.
Yeah.
So in a non-fictional setting, the author doesn't have the freedom to necessarily tell you, here's what this person was thinking at this
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah.
Here's what was going on in their heads. Here's how these two people interacted.
And film is like that. They can't really tell you everything. They have
Yeah,
to.
there's limitations.
Subvertly, they have to
Yeah,
present
because
like.
film is by nature a visual medium. So you're supposed to tell the story visually
Yeah.
and supplement the story with dialogue.
Which is interesting because you used to teach film classes and different things. It's fascinating to hear you say, I love books.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's more insightful into the
Yeah.
story and the person and the character.
Yeah, I feel like there are good filmmakers who
Yeah.
can be that way, but the amount of filmmakers who are thoughtful enough to present in a literary way with a visual literacy
Yeah.
is few and far between.
Yeah.
There's far more authors that are good
Yeah.
at that.
Yeah, and I
than
think
filmmakers.
even our cultural
There's no
patience
call for it. Yeah, yeah.
with that type of long
Yeah.
development of a character.
Yeah.
We don't have the patience for a slow burn
Yeah,
like we used to.
So I think that when I look at fictional stories,
Sure.
good ones, there's tons of
Yeah.
bad ones out there that are just garbage. So it's not across the board, but a well-written fictional
Yeah.
story will put the truth of life or a truth of life on display and explore the nuances
Yeah.
of that truth in a way that most other mediums won't do or can't do. So that's one reason I like fiction.
Yeah.
The other reason is one of my favorite authors is G.K. Chesterton,
Okay.
who wrote nonfiction and fiction,
Yeah.
and was a master at both.
Yeah.
But he said, I'll butcher the quote, but I'm going to try.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
so excited. Fresh quote.
Yeah. So Chesterton said, children shouldn't read fantasy to learn that dragons exist. They already know they exist.
Yeah.
They should read fantasy to learn that they can be killed. And I think that there's so much beauty in that, that especially as a child,
Yeah.
the world around you is a fantasy.
Yeah.
You don't really get that jaded until adolescence.
Yeah.
But as a 5-year-old growing up and having a balloon is like,
Yeah.
what? Can you
Yeah.
see this thing?
Yeah.
It's floating in the air.
Yeah.
And if you've ever watched a child lose a balloon
Oh,
through
yeah.
the air, it's like
devastation.
the magic is disappearing. This magical thing is just floating off. I've lost it now.
Yeah.
So when children are developing, the whole world feels kind of like they can't. There's a reason we don't let kids watch certain movies because they can't differentiate reality from fantasy.
That makes a good sense.
So I think that there's an element of that. We need those fictional stories.
Yeah.
We need monster stories
Yeah.
that tell us monsters can be killed.
Yeah.
Because we don't know if they can be.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that is you're describing why you like that. It's interesting because when I think of fiction books, the books I'm drawn to tend to be children's and young adult.
Yeah.
Because they're lighthearted enough that I don't have to deal with the weight of the world. And so it's not quite an escape, but it's like there's a handful of books of fiction that I have read over the years that were devastating to read.
Yeah.
Like The Kite Runner.
Oh,
some of
yeah,
those,
yeah.
and you're just like that one comes to mind. I'm like, I remember reading that over the course, like I started it and I read it in 2 days because I couldn't put it down because
Yeah,
I was so invested in the characters and the story and just the weight of that.
Yeah.
But life is heavy.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so
Yep.
for pleasure, I don't necessarily
You
want
don't
to
turn to
read
those?
something that I'm like, I
Yeah.
feel so horrible right
Yeah,
now. You know,
yeah.
this is what's going on in the world, right? So I tend to be drawn to like young adult fiction,
Yeah.
those types of things because it's like, I can. It allows the dragons to be slayable.
Yeah, yeah. And
You know?
I think that there is an important, like, there's a place for reading tragedies.
Yeah.
But for me, I have to know where I'm at.
Yeah.
And sometimes I don't read them.
Yeah.
There's one of my favorite authors is Stephen Lawhead.
Okay.
He's written a ton of books in various genres, but they mostly fit within a Celtic fantasy
Okay.
kind of genre. And I read this, he has one series that I was depressed after reading it. Like, it was
More than usual.
more than usual.
I was depressed after.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was,
Wow.
it was overwhelming.
Is that where you disappeared for like those 3 months?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It was, I think it was called I forget the title of the series. It was a trilogy, and I remember the titles of the books, but I don't remember the series. It was so oppressively dark. It was about a man in a current day who is transported back. He kind of goes through these ancient ruins and goes back into an ancient Celtic civilization.
Yeah.
And it's the story of how he interacted and what that civilization was like. And I have to say, it's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
Like, I would go back and read it again.
Yeah.
But I was not prepared for
Yeah.
how much tragedy it was
Yeah.
going to
It's like reading The Road.
incur. Yeah. Oh, that road was rough.
Yeah.
But here's what I'm getting at with that. I don't think that I see value in tragedies.
Sure.
As maybe a cathartic experience or something, but I don't think that a nihilistic view
Yeah.
is necessarily helpful
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I want a book
Sure.
where the characters move through tragedy to hope.
Yeah.
Where the dragons are slain at the end.
Yeah.
Which is why I hated I like the story of Beowulf,
Yeah.
but I hated the adaptation from
Yeah.
several years ago, the
Yeah.
animated version, that it turned Beowulf into this anti-hero almost, or like it took the story in a different direction
Yeah.
and made Beowulf a weak character,
Yeah.
where at the end of this real story, like, he's still a hero.
Yeah.
And I think there's this drive to turn our heroes, instead of our heroes
Yeah.
pulling us to another level, giving us something to shoot for.
Yeah.
There's this drive
Lower your
to lower the heroes to our level,
Yeah.
and kind of like, they're not any better. So when we do things like that, I don't
Yeah.
see the value in it.
Yeah.
I think that fiction stories should give us something
Sure.
to aspire to.
Yeah.
So in this Lawhead series, like, there is so much darkness in it,
Yeah.
but there was these threads of hope that
Yeah.
kind of wove throughout. And by the end, there had been a lot of tragedy, but the people there were still going. They're
Yeah.
still moving towards hope,
Yeah.
and a better life. And even with The Road, you mentioned that one. Reading that one was like a devastating
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
But at the end of it, what is it, 20 years old, so I
Yeah.
don't know if I need a spoiler alert
Yeah.
on that. But at the end of it, one character finds hope.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's exactly
Yeah,
what
yeah.
it didn't end the way I wanted it to.
Yeah.
But there was like tragedy, and then there was hope.
Yeah. You see how dark it is.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
makes even the slightest bit of hope feel like
Yes.
there's survival.
Any spark
There's-
is like
yeah.
a bright light.
Yeah.
And I think that, going back to that whole reason to read fiction, then it draws my mind to hope.
Yeah.
And it helps me think, I see the truth in that. I see the truth in tragedy, and the truth in working through the trauma of it,
Yeah.
and the truth in coming out the other side of it
Yeah.
to hold on to glimmers of hope. I see
Yeah.
truth in there,
Yeah.
and it encourages my spirit.
I think the best authors like lead you through that process.
Yeah.
You know, it's an interesting experience to sit back and listen to you describe it and to think through the books that have done that well. You know, that have invited you into a character that is fully aware of who they are and their faults,
Yeah.
but then also like still aspires to overcome that. You know, and I think of like a lot of the guys that I was reading had experience in some of the great wars. And,
yeah.
and so there was an idealism in their heroes. There was always like evil was present. They were always pushing back against evil, but there was an idealistic format of them where in some ways there wasn't the fault.
Yeah.
There wasn't the failure of that person. There may have been like a hesitancy, but in the end you knew the hero was still going to be the hero.
Yeah,
You knew
yeah.
the bad guy was still going to be the bad guy. And culturally, I think our writing style is you're not sure anymore.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
what does that look like in the way we approach fiction, in a way? So I think the authors I appreciate as well are those that still invite me into the hero's story. Like even if they acknowledge that this person is flawed,
Yep.
they still like leave you with the hope of aspiration to something
Yeah,
different.
I don't mind a flawed hero
Yeah.
because that's what I feel like.
Well, that's why you're a friend with me. So.
Because you're my flawed hero.
I'm your flawed hero. Remember, flogged heroes, whatever. Yeah.
I think there has to be a relatability
Sure,
to it.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
that's one of the reasons why I think it's one of the reasons why we keep making Superman movies and they keep not being that well received.
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting thought.
Because the first Superman movie was like this box office blowout.
Yeah.
Because it made this character really beyond heroic. Like
Yeah.
he was just a clean-cut good guy that always did the right thing.
Yeah.
But that was early 70s.
Yeah. Late 70s.
Late 70s.
I think
Yeah.
so.
I don't remember.
I don't. Yeah.
But the character himself was, you know, truth, justice, and the American way type
Yeah.
of thing.
Yeah.
Just all around good guy.
Yeah.
And every Superman movie since, like more recently, have
Yeah.
tried to like make it dark,
Angsty.
grungy,
Yeah.
not sure where
Who
he's
am
going to go.
I?
Yeah,
Yeah.
always looking.
Oh.
Yeah. And that's the zeitgeist of our time.
Sure.
But it's not a hero that we necessarily want to look up to.
Yeah.
And when you take away the surety of goodness and infuse our own consternation
Yeah.
into that character, but don't let him rise above that,
Yeah.
then what are you left with?
Yeah.
Like, what am I rooting for? I'm just a guy who's a lot
Yeah.
stronger than
he's,
me.
He's way stronger, and I'm hoping he doesn't turn evil.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Which thankfully we have Batman because
Yeah.
he'll take care of it if he does.
Yeah. Lord.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what fictional books have you read? I don't even want to say recently. If it's
Yeah.
recent, sure, but which ones
Yeah.
have made an
I'll
impact?
allow it to stay recent.
Okay.
Because I for Father's Day, one of the things I asked was just a chance to sit down and read a book. And the one that I picked up was it wasn't actually a book. It was a script for a play, but it was Harry Potter and the Cursed Child.
Oh yeah.
So it was after that world. We read those books later in life because we weren't allowed to for a long time. So it's just
That's a little view of our
yeah.
upbringing,
I wasn't. I was just like, oh, people shouldn't like. Why are people? Oh, never mind. I'm
Yeah.
too busy. I'm in college anyway, and it's
Yeah,
a kid's
yeah.
book. But later on we read those and I enjoyed them, which was interesting. But I was just like, I'm going to pick up something fiction to read this summer, and so I was like, oh, they've got this. Let me explore this, and I read it in a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting in what you've described because it's a play, so it was the first portion, so it had all the stage directions, it had it had the thoughts of what that character should be feeling and trying
That's
to communicate
interesting. Yeah.
without actually saying they were doing this. And so it was a lot of those things that you see in the character, but what I found in it was having experienced that world through the original books, to then sit down with this and to go, oh, like, here's the story developing after, and entering into that, and having already appreciated characters, it's like you're coming back to them again.
Yeah.
With a slightly different, in a different stage of life, different season, and the relatability of a father and son that are trying to figure out how do we relate to each other when it's basically Harry's son is now old enough to go out on his own.
Okay.
Or to go off to Hogwarts, and he makes friends with Malfoy's son, and that's their best friends, but he doesn't like his dad. Harry doesn't, or Harry's son doesn't like his dad because he's Harry and he's perfect and everybody likes him, and I don't measure up.
Wow.
And so there's this angst
So
of.
at the core, it's the son never measuring up to the father's.
It's kind of a coming of age, but it's more of it's the development and the tension between a father and son, and the son trying to to make his own way and to say, I'm never good enough for my dad, and I'm gonna figure it out on my own.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a father going, why can't I relate to him? Why is there these barriers between us? And so I don't really, it could have been any book. That theme was something that might, like you described, like your heart sometimes relates to different things.
Yep.
As a dad with a teenage son that is like in that, trying to figure out where he's at, who he is, and we've got a decent relationship to be able to talk about those things.
Yeah, yeah.
But even just feeling that we're in that transition of how do I not squelch his desire for independence, but invite him into a hero's journey in a sense? Like, how do I help him become, like, figure out who he is in a way that isn't trying to make him be me, but is inviting him to chase the way that God's wired him. And so that story it wasn't a long story. I mean, it's a play, so it's like a 2-hour thing. So, but I read it over the course of that day, and just, there were moments of just like crying. Yeah. There were moments of just like joy and laughter and stuff, because they invite you into that fantastical world. And but that's like a more recent thing that I have read. Cool. There's a couple other ones that I have on the docket for this summer that I'd like to try to tackle, but I'm not sure if I actually will.
They're giant?
They're gigantic, The brothers Karamazov, that's one that somebody said, I thought you were a reader and you haven't read that. And I'm like, oh,
then you look at it, it's like 800 pages long.
I'm like, what? No wonder I've never read this. Yeah. So, but I'm thinking about, but that's a pretty philosophical fiction, and it's older. And so the debate in my mind is, do I want to tackle that or something a little more lighthearted?
Like Dune.
Yeah. Jeez, man. So, So what about you? What's something that you've been...
Well, I have to say, I've read more fiction since January than I have in years. And the main reason is because I stopped scrolling through my phone at night before I go to bed.
Yeah.
And I've started just reading at night before I go to bed.
Yeah.
And my goodness, I've read like six books, I think.
Yeah.
Since maybe February.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So
that's because you can't sleep at night.
Well, that's why. Because it's I found that I get a lot more relaxed when I'm reading.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily help me fall asleep quicker, but I'm more relaxed.
Yeah.
So I could read, like there's nights I read for 2 hours after my wife goes to sleep.
Yeah.
And, but I've read the second and third Dune books.
Okay.
Which are absolutely fascinating. Because Dune is an exploration of when your hero becomes your messiah and what that looks like.
Oh, wow.
When the hero, the person that you have wanted to get into power, and then what they do with that power. That was like, that's the book, the first book, which I read a few years ago.
Yeah.
The second book is that person's journey. So
Yeah.
now that they have power, that they were kind of like forced into,
Yeah.
there is this, the religion pushed him into being the Messiah that they wanted.
Yeah.
And they got the Messiah that they wanted, but he's still just a man.
Yeah.
And the toll that it took on him, and how he resolves to move away from that position, or how does he resolve
How does he
that?
reclaim himself?
Yeah,
Yeah.
as who he is rather than who's he
People's
is expected to be.
Yeah.
So that was just so interesting to see that, and see how they're wrestling with this, the internal dialogue of this character, and how he wrestles with who he's expected to be versus who he actually is.
Yeah.
And also the question of whether or not knowing the future is actually a good thing, because that's
yeah.
the whole like hook, is this guy has a prescient mind, so he can see what's going to come, and the reality that that's not necessarily what's best for us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Best for a leader or for a people to know what's coming,
Yeah.
and then make decisions based on, we know what's coming, but then he's like, well, maybe I should let it happen.
Yeah.
Like, I can't change
That would be a
this.
terrifying thing to try to wrestle with. Like, if you have
Yeah,
a vision of
yeah.
what the future looks like, and
Yep.
is it because you made decisions to avoid that, or is it because
Yep.
you didn't, and
Yeah.
that's the stuff that
And
happens?
that's kind of what gets wrestled with. Like, this is actually a tragedy. And the third book goes into that even a little bit more.
Yeah.
With the children of the main character of Paul, and how they're developing, and they want to, I'm like very simplifying the
Yeah,
whole thing.
yeah.
But they're developing and realizing that this isn't, especially the son, because he had twins, and the son was kind of like, we need to do something.
Yeah.
And the daughter then helped him accomplish it. So it was moving towards, I don't think that this is a good thing. I don't think that I should be worshipped, or anyone should be worshipped. I don't think that prescience is a good thing for humanity,
Yeah.
for the best for humanity.
Yeah.
And then how they go about trying to
Yeah.
set things in motion to take that away. So
Yeah.
it's a fascinating exploration
Yeah.
of
You've
all
been
of those
talking about it for a
questions.
while of how much you enjoyed that.
I really did, and it's very deep, and I cannot claim to understand all of it.
Yeah.
I followed a couple of Dune Facebook pages for a while,
Yeah.
and I just got so tired of people arguing
Yeah,
about it that
yeah,
I
yeah.
stopped following them. I'm like, I don't think I understand like
Yeah.
half of it, but I understand enough of it.
Yeah, yeah. I understand enough to enjoy it.
Yeah,
I'll let
yeah.
other people debate about it,
Yeah.
whether it's a world philosophy or worldview or not.
So it was, but it's well worth getting into, because it leads you into that line. Like, you have to think through these
Yeah.
things. The other series that I'm reading is based on Madeleine L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time series.
Okay.
I don't
Yeah.
even know if that's the name of the series. The first book is Wrinkle in Time.
Yeah.
But there's 4 other books that come after it.
Okay.
And they're absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And they also wrestle with some deeply philosophical questions, but primarily it's the question of evil.
Yeah.
And what is evil in the world, and how do we fight against it? The third
Now,
book,
isn't that like a young adult book,
It-
The Wrinkle in Time, or
it
is it like
yeah,
okay.
they're kids. I would say as it goes on, it's less and
It's
less.
less and less, yeah, because
Yeah.
the author is aging to a different group that's
Yeah,
growing up with
perhaps,
it. which-
perhaps. But the first, it's kind of like Narnia, where
Okay.
you can read it as a kid and enjoy the adventure of the story,
Mm-hmm.
but reading it as an adult is
There's other things that are
it's like,
beneath
oh my
the surface,
goodness,
yeah.
yeah, the nuances
That's
of
cool.
what is the nature of evil.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite scenes in the first book is these 3 children are looking for their father, who had been abducted.
Yeah.
And he's a scientist, a physicist, who's studying space and time and like trying to figure out, can you move through space and time?
Yeah.
So he makes this discovery
Thus
and is
the wrinkle
abducted. Yeah,
in time.
that's the
All right,
wrinkle.
yeah.
That time just doesn't go like this. It wrinkles, and you can move from here to here. If you're
Gotcha.
here and they're over here, and you just wrinkle it, then you can just step across. So the wrinkle in time is.
I don't have to read it now.
Yeah,
so.
now you got it. But there's this one scene, they go to this planet that is completely controlled by this evil entity, and it's, everything is perfect.
Oh.
That's what's so fascinating about it. It's not like a hellscape.
Yeah.
It's like suburbia. It's like all the streets are exactly
passes
the
the vibe
same.
check.
All the houses look
Yeah.
exactly the same, and there's a scene where all of the children, like there's an alarm bell that rings, and all of the children come out of the houses, and they have a ball, and they all bounce the ball in unison,
Yeah.
and that's their playtime. So they're all bouncing the ball in unison around the whole thing, and then they just keep doing that, and then a bell rings, and they pick up the ball and step back into the house. That's the playtime's over. But the whole point of that, of describing evil this way, is it's all one mind, and evil seeks to assimilate everything into itself and make it all exactly the same. And so freedom is the opposite of that. Freedom was like the goodness wants everyone to be able to be free and express themselves in their own way, rather than evil just making everything exactly the same.
Yeah.
So that, like, elements like that, you're reading it, and a kid's just like, oh, this is like,
It's just weird.
Yeah, it's weird, but I think for a kid to think my playtime is going and bouncing a ball in the same way as everyone else, a kid looks at that and is like, that is hell.
Yeah.
That is terrible. Oh my goodness, how awful would that be?
Yeah.
As an adult, you're like, oh,
Yeah.
evil really wants everyone to be the same. Like, it erases individuality. So that's the first book. The third book, it was an interesting take on time, where this is so fantastical. You'll love it. A unicorn arrives.
Okay.
There's the threat of nuclear war.
Okay.
And a 15-year-old boy named Charles prays a prayer. It's an ancient rune.
Yeah.
And this unicorn comes and says, "You've called me with this rune."
Yeah.
And he's like, and the unicorn's like, "We have to ride the wind. I don't really know where we're going. I just know where the wind takes me."
Yeah.
But you called, and now you have to get on and ride. And the unicorn can't ride through space. He can only ride through time.
Okay.
So the ride he jumps on, and the ride is always like described as wind and darkness and all of this. And then they arrive at the same place he got on,
Really?
just at a different time. So the unicorn just rides through time, which is like this crazy.
Yeah. This explains why we don't have unicorns anymore.
Yeah, that's why, because you don't
It's
pray
like
for
Willy
them.
Wonka's tunnel.
But this book explores the evil that happened centuries before the threat of nuclear war.
Gotcha.
And how decisions that were made then
put in
rippled
play.
through time.
Yeah.
And then you arrive at this, like, hundreds of years later.
Yeah.
And there's this thread of darkness. There's always something good, but then there's this thread of this dark thread that goes all through time.
It's almost like, is it similar to like Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, where you get to go back in some ways and see what, like, the story behind and how it has affected the way that the present reality is, and then all the stuff that comes out of that.
It is, because he's going through different time periods,
Gotcha.
and it's very nonlinear, because he's like native peoples in New England, and then 1800s, and then all the way back to pre-discovery, when the Welsh came, pre-Columbus era, and so it's kind of this nonlinear, but you see the connecting threads this happened then, and the ancestors.
Gotcha.
And that ancestor was connected to that. Oh, so this is why now there's a threat of nuclear war in the current day, because 800 years ago, these decisions were made and affected all these ancestries.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating to have this conversation and just realize that, both of us, I think, have benefited from the engagement in story in ways that, like, is life-giving and enjoyable. And some folks, they may just be like, oh yeah, I read fiction all the time, and other folks never read fiction. But I think as you were describing all of this, and we've talked about books that we've been reading just off and on, just
Yeah.
randomly. What I didn't quite like, what connected for me was you were like, oh yeah, I've read a lot lately because I put my phone down at night. And I was like,
Yeah, yeah.
oh yeah, it's and like for me, I do a lot of audiobooks at times, and so that's one of the ways I consume. I tend to want the book for fiction.
Yeah,
But there have
yeah.
been a handful that I have read via audiobook, and it's like when I'm doing dishes at night, or when I'm doing something on my own, or I'm mowing in the yard.
Yep.
It's the intentional decision to make it a priority that
Yeah,
allows
yeah.
you the opportunity to enter into these worlds, and I think it's a fun thing to think through.
Yeah.
How much we actually enjoy fictional narratives. So
To engage in the stories of other people, even though they're fictional people.
yeah,
You keep looking for the truth in
that's
it.
awesome.
And I
Yeah.
think I think there's a lot of value in that. It teaches us about each other, and it teaches us about ourselves.
Yeah.
Whether it's a mystery,
Yeah.
like I've described, you read a fantasy.
Yeah.
I've described both a fantasy and a sci-fi.
Yeah.
But even like a mystery novel
Yeah.
is, here are characters. The classic flow of a story is, these are the characters
Yeah.
dealing with a pressure point, dealing with a rising conflict,
Yeah.
and how they resolve that conflict.
Yeah.
And I think there's value in that story arc.
Yeah.
And seeing, how do you resolve this conflict?
Yeah, I think good fiction is philosophical.
Yeah.
And it exercises our ability to be discerning in reading it. Like, you can read to escape, but you can also read to develop.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
To
to
train the
engage.
muscles of
Yep,
the
yep.
way you see. And in some ways it informs the way that I interact with people in society
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I had a prof in college he felt the same way about film as he did about books. He was a literature prof, but he's like everybody is telling a worldview.
Yeah, yeah.
And so,
It's all a conversation.
yeah. And so so he really opened that door for me to be able to look at books as not just the transfer of information, but really an invitation into exploring thought and worldview and perspective and experience. And so I think the exercise of fiction is worth
Yeah.
engaging
Yeah.
with.
And sometimes it's just fun.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
And sometimes we really just need some fun.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's a great point.
So I think that's a good place to wrap up.
I think so.
Thanks.
Fantastic.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Go read something fun.
Yeah.
Go read something enjoyable. Don't get stuck just in a non-fictional
Yeah.
way. Like, engage with stories
Yeah.
that capture your imagination,
Yeah.
that capture thought and display thought and truth in a way that really can be explored and engaged with
Yeah.
and grasped.
Yeah. So much of what we consume is heavy.
Yeah.
And so nonfiction tends to be that. Very rarely is nonfiction like,
Not heavy.
hey, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a good point. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
Have a good week.
All right,
Bye-bye.
bye.